Hello, everyone. Welcome back to From the Dark Side. I'm your host, Sherry, and I'm so thankful to have you here with me today. You might notice there's no intro music this time. That's because Spotify has started cracking down on creators over music credits. Even though I always include the creative licensing info in the episode description and I 100% have permission to use the track, I've been using the same song every week forever. But now it's posing an issue. I'm still weirded out about it, so I'm giving Spotify what they want. By the way, it's not just me. This is happening to a lot of shows recently. I do feel lost without my intro music, though, so I had to throw some thunder in there. But soon we'll have some new beats. Also, as a reminder, if you like the show, be sure to follow if you haven't already. Let's get into the story. This case was requested by two different people. I don't get a ton of requests, so the fact that two different people requested it means we should probably check it out. Karina Holmer is from Sweden. She came to America to work for a nice family for the summer, and at first things seemed good. But later Karina wrote her friends back home that things weren't going like she planned. She vanished one night, and part of her remains would be located a few days later. This case is unsolved and is one of the biggest mysteries out of the city of Boston. This is episode 176. The Case of Karina Holmer. We're heading back to 1996 for this one. We had the Summer Olympics in Atlanta. Scientists successfully cloned the first mammal whose name was Dolly the sheep. The world lost Tupac Shakur and Ella Fitzgerald. Pokemon debuted as a video game. The Chicago Bulls set a world record by winning 72 games. Ted Kaczynski was captured. And in weird news from 1996, McDonald's launched the Arch Deluxe, which was supposed to be the super sophisticated gourmet burger for adults. It ended up being a complete flop, but only after McDonald's had spent $100 million on its advertising. Karina Holmer was born September 7th, 1975, making her 20 years old at the time this case takes place. Half the articles I weeded through say she's 19, but she was actually 20. Karina was born and raised in Sweden. The town she grew up in, Skillingaryd, had a few thousand residents. It had one grocery store, a train stop, and a handful of small factories. It's one of those towns where everyone knows the local mechanic, the baker, the postman, and everyone's parents. Winters were very cold, and there's almost always snow on the ground. Karina is described as kind. She did well in school. She later attended a hospitality school since she wanted to someday run a business. She had an older sister named Johanna. Karina had dreams of traveling the world. She loved animals, especially dogs. One newspaper article I found, a former classmate remembered how she used to volunteer to help at a neighbor's farm feeding animals just for the fun of it. A few months before our story takes place, Karina bought a lottery ticket and won 10,000 crowns, which was equivalent to around 1,500 American dollars. She decided to use this money to fund a trip to the United States. So she found an advertisement for an au pair. So I had never heard of an au pair before this case. According to my friend, Mr. Google, an au pair is a young foreign person who cares for children and does domestic housekeeping for a family. In return, the person gets room, board, and a small wage. So at the time, lots of young women from Sweden were leaving to come to America and work as an au pair for families in the U.S. It's basically the same as being a live-in nanny. Karina was fascinated by America, especially because in the mid-90s, U.S. pop culture was everywhere. She loved the idea of traveling and meeting people who lived in a country that seemed so much different from her small town in Sweden. Ironically, a lot of us here in America would love to go visit Sweden for a few months. The agency that Karina went to found a good match for her, a family in Dover, Massachusetts. Frank and Susan have 2 children, a son in first grade and a daughter who was around 2 or 3. The family was described as being well off. They lived in a nice condo. The town they're in is about 30 minutes outside of Boston. Frank worked as a commercial photographer and Susan was an artist. Specifically, she's a painter. She was also a college professor who taught art and design. Their living situation was a little different than a majority of married couples. Frank had a loft apartment in the city of Boston where he did a lot of his commercial photography sessions. He would live there Monday through Friday. On Saturdays and Sundays, he would come back to their condo in Dover, 30 minutes away. He would spend the weekend with his wife and kids and then go back to Boston for the week. This family was looking for an au pair to help out while Susan did her paintings and teaching during the day. They were not new to having au pairs stay with them, and Karina would be their sixth. Karina would receive a place to live, food, amenities, and a paycheck. She planned to leave Sweden and fly to Massachusetts in March 1996. Her plan was to spend the spring and summer with the host family and then fly back to Sweden. Karina spent the winter preparing for the trip, reading about American customs, practicing her English, and telling all her friends about her big trip coming up. Finally, the day came when it was time to go. Her parents took her to the airport. No one could have imagined how her story would end just a few months later. The last thing she said to her dad was, "I hope I'm doing the right thing." She arrived at Frank and Susan's home, and the children just loved her. She unpacked and got settled in. She was told everything that was expected of her, and Karina was really happy to be there. Somehow, and I don't know if she obtained this before she came to the U.S. or afterwards, but Karina was able to get her hands on a fake ID, one that showed that she was 21 years old. Here in the U.S., the legal drinking age is 21. Karina would now be able to get into bars when she wasn't working. She did make some friends during her time here. There were other au pairs from Sweden that she came over with, so the girls all stayed in contact with one another and hung out on the weekends. Karina was settling in great with the family. She played sports with the kids and games. She really loved those two kids and did great being their nanny. Having this position of an au pair for Frank and Susan had an added bonus. She only had to work Monday through Friday and would be off on the weekends. So remember, Dad Frank had a loft apartment in the city of Boston that he stayed at Monday through Friday. Well, he told Karina that on weekends while he wasn't there, she was welcome to stay at the apartment and then come back to their regular home on Sunday nights. So this was perfect. It's right in downtown Boston. She could go to bars and clubs with her friends, and it's all within a short walking distance of the apartment. Plus, it gave her privacy away from the family for a couple days a week. Boston in the 1990s had a thriving club scene. There were these clubs in the theater district where Karina liked to hang. They were filled with dance music, neon lights, and a crowd of students and travelers. Karina loved dancing, but she was not this completely reckless party girl. She was careful when she went out. She always made sure other people were around her that were safe people. She seemed to keep her guard up pretty well. Life in Massachusetts seemed good. She sent letters home talking about Frank and Susan's children that she cared for, the weekend trips she took into Boston with other au pairs. She talked about the city of Boston, which is one of the oldest cities in America, and said she was fascinated by it. She wrote about trying new foods, visiting historic places, and hearing live music that was really loud. These first few letters to family and friends back home were good, and no one was worried about Karina since she seemed to be having a good time. Then the letters became a little less happy. She said how she missed Sweden and was getting bored caring for other people's kids. She said she was lonely and thinking about cutting her trip short and coming home before the end of summer. Then she said this trip was not anything like how she thought it was going to be, and she was stressed out all the time. It didn't seem like it had anything to do with the kids, but she's now anxious to leave. Her last letter home was darker than the rest. She wrote a cryptic line that can be interpreted a couple different ways. Karina wrote in the letter to her friend Ulrika, "Something terrible has happened. I cannot tell you what it is, but I will tell you when I get home." This is so frustrating because we will never know what that terrible thing was that happened. No one has ever found out what she meant by that. According to Cold Case New England, on the night of June 21st, 1996, Karina and her friends got ready to head out for a night of fun. They got dressed and did their makeup at Frank's loft apartment that Karina stayed at on weekends. Karina wore shiny black pants, a silver top, and a small backpack purse. They headed to Zanzibar, which is a popular nightclub. The friends all stayed for hours, drinking, talking, and enjoying themselves. But sometime after midnight, the friends began to separate and some decided to leave early. Karina isn't ready to call it a night just yet. Karina was described as being intoxicated during this time. I'm not blaming her friends here, but I really wish one of them would have said, "Too bad, you're coming with us." Witnesses say Karina left the club or was escorted out around 3:20 a.m., possibly because she'd had too much to drink or because the club was closing. Outside, she was seen near Boylston Street, which is right next to Zanzibar's entrance. A few people remembered her standing on the sidewalk, smiling and talking to people she just met. One witness remembers seeing Karina dancing with a homeless man. Then a man came walking up. He was wearing a Superman t-shirt. Karina took an immediate interest in talking to him because he had this big fluffy dog with him, and the dog was wearing a matching Superman shirt. Don't get me wrong, seeing a big fluffy dog when you're outside of a bar and you're drunk, most people are going to be so excited and want to walk up and pet him. I'm getting the vibe that this guy does this a lot to talk to drunk women. Why else would he be walking his dog past nightclubs at 3:30 in the morning? Locals did confirm that they've seen him do this countless times. So we have witnesses that say Karina was seen playing with this guy's dog and calling him a good boy. Then Karina vanished. No one saw her alive again. 2 days later, around 2 miles away from Club Zanzibar, a man was looking around in dumpsters. He was collecting cans and scrap metal that he could turn in for cash. He came across this greenish-black trash bag inside a dumpster. This bag was heavier than the others. It weighed 48 pounds. He tore it open, and when he peered inside, he saw what appeared to be a woman's arm. He saw the hand had painted nails. He ran down the street screaming for help. Boston police officers led by Detective Thomas O'Leary arrived at the dumpster and opened the bag completely. They were shocked by what they were looking at. Trigger warning. So they found the remains of a woman, but it was only the top half. Her legs and pelvic area were not in the bag. She had been sawed in half. They searched the dumpster looking for her bottom half, but it wasn't in there. Just to skip ahead, the bottom half was never found. Even today in 2025, it is still missing. Evidence showed that she had been strangled to death with a cord or rope of some type due to the ligature marks around her neck. She had been cleaned and washed and her makeup removed. There is 0 blood in this dumpster since she had been cleaned so well. An autopsy was performed, and the medical examiner determined that she had been sawed in half by an electric saw since the cut was so precise and clean. The woman was identified as 20-year-old Karina Holmer. The detectives and medical examiner realized that whoever did this to her had some familiarity with anatomy. The cuts were neat and didn't look like they were done in a moment of panic. This suggests that the person had the time and the privacy. This dumpster was not the crime scene. Karina was killed somewhere else and then placed here. This person probably has a garage or lives alone and was able to use power tools. This likely wasn't a random act of violence committed in an alley. Toxicology tests showed alcohol consistent with what her friends said that she had been drinking that night. There was no evidence of drugs or signs of sexual assault on the remains, but it's hard to find signs of sexual assault when you're missing everything from the waist down. Boston police quickly cordoned off the area. They searched nearby dumpsters and canvassed around for witnesses. They traced Karina's last known movements back to Zanzibar. Dozens of people who had been at the club that night were interviewed, which was difficult since a majority of them were intoxicated, so they're trying to remember as best as they could. One person said that they saw her talking to two men in a silver car. Another said there were four men in the car. Another said it wasn't her, it was someone else. This is all messy. Also, I can't imagine driving the streets of Boston late at night when the bars are letting out. I imagine that is some kind of traffic nightmare. People aren't really paying attention to one particular person. The police questioned her host family, her friends, and anyone who might have seen her after leaving the club. They searched Frank's weekend apartment that Karina was staying at. They also searched apartments that were near Club Zanzibar, but no one was arrested. They couldn't find anything to tie anyone to this crime. The investigators looked at every angle. They focused on three main theories early on. The people that she knew the best, which were her host family, her friends, and any romantic relationships. Even a Boston police officer that was rumored to be dating Karina was questioned. And the last people to see her alive, which were other Zanzibar club patrons, bouncers, and the man with the dog. And the possibility of a stranger attack, someone who picked her up after the club or offered her a ride. This is one of the strangest killings I've heard of because it feels too deliberate to be random, but too detached to fit any personal motive. They checked out the trash bag that Karina's upper body was found in, hoping it was some kind of rare contractor's trash bag that could only be bought at certain stores. But unfortunately, it was just a very common brand sold in Walmarts and lots of other retail stores in the U.S. A partial fingerprint was found on the trash bag, and this gave everyone hope that the killer could be identified, but unfortunately it was too small to work with. They also believed the killer used gloves, so this fingerprint could have came from the guy who found the trash bag and called police. Of course, the first people they want to talk to formally are Karina's host family, Frank and Susan. Reporters described the studio apartment that Karina was using that belonged to Frank as having the kind of large space that some imagine could pull off a dismemberment. That is just speculation and someone's opinion, though. Police searched the apartment, they interviewed Frank and Susan, and collected a few bags of evidence. Nothing formally tied them to the murder, though. But just one day after Karina's body was found, police are called to another dumpster. This time, the dumpster was on fire. The fire was quickly put out by the fire department, but police are wondering if anything inside this dumpster might tie them to Karina. This dumpster was 200 feet from Frank and Susan's condo. Police sifted through the charred items in the dumpster. They did find some women's clothing, but none belonged to Karina. The couple were never charged, but because of that ominous letter Karina had written to her friend back in Sweden saying something terrible had happened, everyone was speculating that Frank or Susan had something to do with this crime. Something in that household had gone wrong, but to this day, no evidence has been found about what went wrong. As the weeks passed, detectives interviewed around 300 people in total. Karina's face was on the front page of all the local newspapers. The newspaper headlines were kind of rough, like Swedish nanny found sliced in half and pretty blonde found in dumpster and who killed the nanny. Karina had talked to a number of people that night. Remember, some say she was talking to 2 people in a car. Another says it was 4 people in a car. She was allegedly spotted outside of a 24-hour convenience store, which was only 1 mile from where the dumpster was. Another person said she was standing outside of Club Zanzibar and complaining about her friends ditching her. The final report placed Karina walking by herself on Tremont Street between 3 and 4 in the morning. It's so frustrating because if this happened in 2025, we would have high def 4K surveillance footage of every street in Boston. We would have GPS info from cars, tons and tons of cell phone data that would show her every move. But it was 1996 and any surveillance was grainy at best, and no one around here had a cell phone. So the au pair agencies contacted by police had no record of Karina Holmer. They later learned that the agency that she went through was unlicensed. The guy running it had been charged twice before for operating without a license. We don't know if Karina knew this or not. I doubt she walked in and wanted to see papers that it was a real licensed business. The problem with these unlicensed agencies are if anything happened to this person, there's nothing documenting that they are in the country, which is exactly what happened here. This man was supposedly distraught over this and said he took full accountability for Karina's death and he closed his business. According to reporting by Cold Case New England, the FBI was brought in to analyze this killer. I always love when they bring the profilers in. I just think it's so cool. Everyone assumed this was a serial killer since she was cut in half. But forensic psychologists agreed that this wasn't the kind of mutilation serial killers usually display. Usually they cut off arms and legs and things like that, not just a one-swipe bilateral cut. The FBI thought this was an inexperienced first-time offender who only cut Karina in half so she could be disposed of easier. Karina's parents traveled to Boston after the murder, hoping for answers. The local Swedish community in Massachusetts rallied to support them and welcome them to Boston. Vigils were held, letters came from people around the world offering sympathy. Karina's upper half of her body was transported back to Sweden, and a huge funeral took place in their town. Everyone at the service wore bright colors, and Karina's casket was adorned with flowers. No one could believe how this could happen. She had only been in the United States for 3 months, and it was her first time ever leaving Sweden. Let's get into the theories. There were rumors. Again, these are rumors. No evidence has been found to prove this. Some wondered if perhaps Karina and Frank were in a relationship and she had become pregnant. Maybe it was consensual, maybe it was non-consensual. Maybe this was the terrible thing that she had written to her friend. This would explain why the bottom half of her remains were missing from right below the ribcage. The reason I don't think this theory holds up is because I feel like they could have done a blood test to determine if she was pregnant. Plus, Karina was out drinking. If she was pregnant, she likely wouldn't be getting wasted drunk. Side note, she was so intoxicated that one of the bartenders at Zanzibar said he was serving her water by the end of the night, pretending like it was alcohol and just not charging her card for it. Did Frank or Susan have something to do with this crime? I did read some non-official, shaky sources at best that said Susan's website showing her art had weird depictions of Karina in some of her paintings, like subliminally. I looked around to see if I could find any, and they weren't on her current website, so I don't know what that was about. But apparently at one time she had some art for sale, and the person in the paintings resembled Karina. Frank had an alibi, and so did Susan. Not airtight ones, but enough to be considered an alibi. Everything I've read says that they were uncooperative and even hostile towards the police during the investigation, though. And other au pairs who had worked for them said Frank was creepy and flirted with them a lot and even said some things that crossed the line. A singer from a metal band who frequently played at the Zanzibar Club was questioned because the guy was known to be a little odd. He had a big collection of animal bones and sang about S&M bondage. This was considered super taboo in the 90s. Nowadays, not so much. He was known to be deep into active heroin addiction. He ends up getting cleared because they had zero evidence tying him to the crime. They learned Karina had been dating a Boston police officer. They weren't super official, but they had been on a few dates. He was allegedly on vacation out of town during the time of the murder, but this fueled rumors of some sort of cover up by the Boston police. One person the police were really anxious to talk to and is considered suspect number one or two is Herb Whitten. Herb was the man in his late 40s who loved to show up at bars and clubs in the early morning hours with his cute dog in the Superman shirt. Herb lived 40 minutes away. To me, this is super predatory behavior. The fact that he drives all the way to the theater district in Boston just to walk his dog around drunk college-age girls leaving the bars is odd to me. Herb admitted to police that he gets more attention from women when he has his dog with him, so that's why he does it. Is it possible that Herb had something to do with Karina's murder? We know that they talked a bit that night and Karina was playing with his dog while she was intoxicated and hanging by herself outside of the bar. So it must have been Herb's lucky night because after he left Zanzibar, he got in his car to make the 40-minute drive back to his home and he was pulled over by police. He was issued a speeding ticket, so that gives him an alibi. This doesn't fit the timeline since Karina was killed around this time. A lot ask if it was possible that Herb had Karina's body in the trunk when he was pulled over. Police did process his car and no evidence surfaced that Karina was in there anywhere. So, as I mentioned, Herb was high up on the suspect list. Everyone knew this and most assumed he offered Karina a ride home since she was drunk. He tried to sexually assault her and she fought back and he killed her. That's the public's opinion. That speeding ticket may have been what saved him from being charged. But it gets worse because 1 year after Karina's murder, police arrived at Herb's home and found him deceased. A welfare check was called in and they found he had taken his own life. Some speculated that it was because he couldn't deal with the guilt because he murdered Karina, while others say he was distraught over being considered a suspect and everyone thinking he did this really awful thing. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one, and the simplest explanation is that Karina encountered a stranger that night who offered her a ride or lured her away from the club. Perhaps she trusted this person because she was drunk and vulnerable. This killer took her to an isolated location, killed her, dismembered her, and put her in a dumpster. I have a hard time believing that this was a spontaneous crime. This killer had tools and the privacy of dismembering her. But who could have done it and why? A lot believe the answer lies closer to home, perhaps within her circle of acquaintances and not a random stranger. Remember the letter she wrote her friend back home? She mentioned something terrible happened and she was cutting her trip short. She was super anxious to leave and come home. As I mentioned earlier, local rumors suggested a relationship with someone connected to her host family. Police did thoroughly investigate that in 1996, but no one was charged. Karina's parents back in Sweden have rarely spoken to the media. These folks want privacy and closure. I always feel for the families in cases like this because they never get to complete the process of mourning because the story has no ending. It's been almost 30 years since Karina left this world. This is very much a cold case, and it's hard for all of us to accept that a young woman's murder could remain forever unanswered. But cold cases have been solved decades later, and this could still be solved. Cases like this one end up getting solved in the form of a DNA match from stored evidence tested with new modern technology. Even if a trace of DNA from the bag, the body, or the dumpster still exists, it could someday be matched to someone in the National CODIS database. Investigators have never said whether they have a DNA sample, which makes me think that they don't. Also, Karina's bottom half has never been found, but it's likely long gone by now. There's always a chance of a deathbed confession. A confession seems unlikely after so many years, but it's not impossible. Cases from the 70s and 80s have been solved by people revealing things on their deathbed decades later. Or a witness finally deciding to come forward. This is the one that police hope for. Someone who was outside Zanzibar that night back in 1996, someone who saw her get into a car, someone who recognized the person she was with but stayed quiet out of fear or not wanting to get involved. Any of those people could still exist. It's truly scary that this killer could still be alive and walking around today. The FBI said they believed this was a first-time offender, but he or she was likely to commit again. I think it's so frustrating because we still have no primary crime scene. This person did a horrible act somewhere else and then brought her to the dumpster. I hate that people can get away with this for so long. For Boston, Karina's death became a reminder that safety is so important, that a moment's decision to trust the wrong person can change everything. If we've learned anything from Karina's case, don't leave your drunk friends alone outside of a bar where they don't know anyone. If they won't come with you, do something. Call their parents if you absolutely have to. You might feel like you're overstepping at the moment, but it's better to have like an awkward conversation the next morning than to live with the regret of knowing something terrible could have been prevented. For Sweden, Karina's death was a national tragedy that made people question about how young au pairs were protected when they came to the States. Agencies had to crack down on background checks on host families, and there was more resources for providing local support networks for young women here visiting from other countries. Club Zanzibar is long gone. The area of Boylston Street where Karina was last seen has changed storefronts dozens of times. The building next to the dumpster where her body was found has been renovated and looks completely different now. The city has moved on, but no one will ever forget 20-year-old Karina Holmer. She left a mark in Boston. I know there's memorials for her in Sweden, but I'm unsure if there's any in Boston. Karina would be 50 years old today in 2025. She is buried in Sweden, but I'm unsure of the cemetery. There have been no new leads in recent years, but we still hold on to hope that someday her killer will be found. Rest in peace to Karina Holmer. That's it for this week, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all.